Can everybody see a PowerPoint?
Currently, no. Oh, there we go. Yes.
Excellent. Well, Shemai, everybody. Hello, I'm Joseph Phillips, lecturer in politics at Cardiff University. And today we are going to be talking about polarization. So here's kind of the general story. I'm sure this is one that a lot of folks who are covering polarization have seen, which is it's kind of a two-way street. On the one hand, we think, oh, well, when people dislike members of the opposing party or any sort of opposing political group, it motivates them to become engaged in politics because perhaps through persuading others to vote a certain way, through displaying their candidate's sign in a window, at the very least, we can help get our candidates elected and at least keep the other party out. And to the extent that we consider participation democratic good, then affective polarization has this kind of nice consequence. On the other hand, we also have this idea of affective polarization as leading people to have very flimsy commitments to democratic norms. And so you can imagine it as, I have here on the screen, January 6th, the idea that Republicans would be so distrusting of Democrats that they would be easily led to believe that the Democrats stole the election in 2020 and thus engage in a coup attempt to try to counteract it. And when we look at the literature on this, various observational studies, mostly cross-sectional, some of them having a couple of panel waves, will generally corroborate this. So we see in a series of studies that people who display a higher level of partisan animosity tend to be more politically engaged, and they also tend to have more anti-democratic attitudes. However, two experiments have come to give us all quite a lot of pause on this. And when I first saw these, I went, oh man. And that there are these experiments that show that when you successfully manipulate affective polarization, that is to decrease it, you don't find any sort of corresponding decrease in any of these issues with democratic norms. People's attitudes toward them basically don't change. And so, like any person going through grief, this was my dissertation topic. As Daryl knows, he was a committee member on that. I don't want affective polarization to cause nothing because, well, why are we studying it if it doesn't have an effect? So, of course, one of the first copes was, oh, well, it's just an experiment. Just because you can manipulate numbers that people supply doesn't mean that you're really affecting real emotions underneath. The less copy version of that is that perhaps, with experiments, these things just take place on a much longer time scale, that once you update people's attitudes toward the other side, other things surrounding that might take a bit longer of a time to update than what we've followed people in the field for. And if that's the case, then with longitudinal studies, this is something that should kind of counteract this. Something else that might be going on is that all these nice little observational studies are capturing between-person differences. So it's that the types of people who are polarized are the types of people who display high engagement and flimsy commitments to democratic norms. But this isn't a causal story. And if this is the case, then with proper sorts of longitudinal methods, we should see any sort of association disappear. Another possibility is reverse causality, the idea that perhaps affective polarization is the consequence, not the cause, of the things that we think it affects. And so it might be the case that people who are more politically engaged might end up having much more concrete ideas as to who they like and who they don't like in politics. People who have flimsy commitments to democratic norms might end up distrusting members of the other side out of intuiting that the other side, too, might have those flimsy commitments. You can create a story off of that. Of course, bidirectional relationships that are mutually reinforcing are possible, though only reverse causality would kind of explain the lack of experimental support. So in order to test kind of what's going on with this disjuncture between the observational studies and the experiments, my co-authors and I locate every panel study that we can possibly look at. And Mark Brandt, if you're listening, this includes your affective polarization study as well. These studies span 7 decades from the 1950s all the way up to the present day in several largely Western democracies, with a total N of just above 300,000. And what we do in order to kind of test, perhaps, is it just enough to go to longitudinal world, is to look at these two types of models. The first is a cross-lag panel model, which I'm sure is very familiar in these audiences. In this audience, where basically you're trying to predict y at time 2 with x and y at time 1, and also x at time 2 with x and y at time 1. Problem with these sorts of models is that they tend to conflate between person differences and within person change, while random intercept cross-lag panel models do a better job of separating these things. So if it's the case that this is a between person but not a within person association, then we'll find effects with these first set of models, the cross-lagged ones, but then they disappear with the random intercept cross-lag panel models. If it's a case of reverse causality, then, well, we'll just find that the things that we think are outcomes of polarization are actually causes of it, and these will hold up with the RICLPMs here. And so now for the results, we're going to play a little bit of a game of peekaboo here. So begin with the cross-lag panel models and then reveal what the random intercept cross-lag panel models find. So these are random effects meta-analyses of the various panel studies done, kind of the only way of displaying these with any level of coherence. There's too many data sets. And these are some outcomes for political engagement. So political discussion, interest, turnout, acts of participation beyond it. And if you don't want to read coefficients and standard errors, the findings in bold are the statistically significant ones. And so we generally find that for all of the indicators, various levels of political engagement seem to predict higher levels of affective polarization downstream, which would suggest a reverse causality story, though we also find that affective polarization is related to higher levels of political discussion and interest downstream. But what happens when we estimate the random intercept cross-lag panel models? Every last one of those findings disappears into nothing. Now, there is a between-person parameter in these models, and the between-person association parameter remains positive and significant. But none of these sorts of within-person associations are statistically significant. So we also looked at various political perceptions and emotions from these data sets. So things like political cynicism, internal and external efficacy, emotions regarding politics. And we don't find a lot when it comes to cynicism or either type of efficacy, though it does seem to be that there's this mutually reinforcing relationship between affective polarization and negative emotions regarding the country, and some evidence that affective polarization correlates with less positive emotions regarding the country. What happens when we run the RICLPMs then? Yep, every single one of those findings doesn't survive either. So what about for things like political trust, which isn't quite democratic norms, but you can imagine that people with low levels of trust are susceptible to flimsy commitments to democratic norms because they might not trust the other side to keep them either. And so we have things like trust in elections here, trust in various media outlets, both out and in party, and just overall political trust. We see that there's an interesting split in the American samples among Democrats and Republicans in 2020 to 2022, where there's this mutually reinforcing positive relationship between affective polarization and trust in elections among Democrats, and then a negative mutually reinforcing one among Republicans. Not a lot going on with trust in the media in general, but you also see that there's this mutually reinforcing relationship between affective polarization and higher trust in partisan media, and then a negative one between affective polarization and trust in out-partisan media. And there seems to be some indication that people who are more affectively polarized tend to be less politically trustful. So what do we see with the RICLPMs? Well, some things actually survive. So the finding that mutually reinforcing negative relationship between affective polarization and trust in elections survives among Republicans in 2020 to 2022. The finding that trust in partisan media predicts affective polarization down the line also survives. Or, yeah, and the finding that trust in partisan media predicts lower affective polarization, these survive. So some things do. A good chunk of things also don't. So now for kind of the fun stuff, the democratic norm stuff, connecting it to the experiments. So we find things like support for the right to engage in collective action, the general tone of political discussion, who people have as political contacts. These are just sort of softer democratic norms things, but the precursor to harder sorts of democratic norms. What we find here is that people who are more affectively polarized have more negative discussion tone. That's how it's coded. I know it looks a little wonky. It's a mutually reinforcing one. You also find this effect where affective polarization has a mutually reinforcing relationship with having more contacts from your own party and fewer from the opposite party. But when we look at the RICLPMs, none of this survives. None of them. But what about for these really, really spicy democratic norm stuff? So things like the belief that the recent election was conducted with fraud, wanting to keep Trump in office longer than his term would have allowed back in the 2020 election cycle in order to combat any sort of electoral fraud accusation or support for political violence. Well, when you run these regular cross-like panel models, you find there's not much going on with Democrats, but there's this strong relationship between affective polarization and belief there has been election fraud among Republicans, with some evidence of that the arrow goes the other way as well. And you also find this huge effect among Republicans for affective polarization on desire to keep Trump in office, again, somewhat mutually reinforcing. Notably, I will note that the cross-lag panel models don't show any cross-lag effects of polarization on support for political violence or vice versa. But when you run the RICLPMs, every last thing disappears. So what are we left with? Well, we seem to have a lot of support, not universal support. There are some findings that do seem to survive, but pretty much all of the effects of affective polarization that we see are between person. So it seems that the kinds of people who are affectively polarized are the kinds of people who display higher levels of political engagement, perhaps lower trust, perhaps flimsier commitments to democratic norms, or at least kind of fickle ones. So there are a few key possibilities to what's going on, and it'd be cool to have a conversation with folks about what this might be. One kind of takeaway is perhaps affective polarization is just not potent enough. Jamie Druckmann is coming up with this new idea with some colleagues about partisan sectarianism. So perhaps dislike is not enough. There needs to be this other sort of belief regarding the other side alongside it. It might be that affective polarization is not so much a cause of various democratic ills as much as it is a symptom. In earlier talks I've done about this, I've called it a syndrome, and then people start asking, "Hey Joe, what's the syndrome?" I don't know. I don't know. All I know is that perhaps this is a symptom of it, that there's a certain type of citizenship that is developed in a lot of Western countries, in a lot of democratic countries, of which affective polarization is one of the components of it. I think that the belief systems approach that Abigail Casaro and Mark Branner champion might be a very, very good way of pursuing something like this. But it could also be that the individual level, of which all these analyses were, is the wrong one to look at. And that it's really that polarized polities have problems. It's not that polarized individuals have problems with democracy. So all these potential things could be at play here. However, there's more to do. I haven't finished all my nights of nights on R, eating Cheez-Its and waiting for things to run. I'm going to be running these with fixed effects models because those are also fairly rigorous ways of testing within person effects. And I'm going to see how much these findings depend on lag, particularly with the idea that, well, if experiments might have a hard time finding effects due to the time lag, maybe the longitudinal studies do as well. And so with that, thank you all for listening. Look forward to your feedback.
All right, Joe, thank you. And I promise it's not just an empty room. There are people here clapping. So we may have time for one or two quick questions for Joe. Yeah.
Just a quick clarification and then a follow-up. Is affective polarization being measured here with the standard feeling thermometer items?
Yes.
Okay, so I guess 2 points on that. One is we know that these are just terrible measures. People use them in really weird ways that may vary within individual over time. So I worry a lot about measurement error. And I know Chris Federico and co-authors have developed a better measure of affective polarization that could give us a different story. But the other piece is that these measures often don't distinguish between elite and mass as the target of affect. And so including in these experiments, I could see changing affect towards the mass partisans, but that's not really what matters for institutionally oriented kinds of outcomes like violence or electoral actions. What matters is attitudes towards the elites, which aren't necessarily being captured here. So just any thoughts on that?
Yeah, should I respond to this? I also see Mark's hand up here.
Yeah, go ahead and respond to this. We'll take Mark's question, and then Rob, if you want to perhaps set your computer up in the meantime.
Yeah, so on the measurement, the point's fully taken about thermometers. I too don't think that they're the greatest form of measurement in the world for affective polarization. It was more just a trade-off between what we could do with a lot of panels and a lot of generalizability versus perhaps getting it down to maybe one data set in one area. And so, yeah, at the sacrifice of perhaps crisper measures, this is what we found. But it could be that with better measures, such as partisan sectarianism or Chris Federico's approach, that you'd end up finding something else. On the difference between elite and mass affective polarization, there is one panel that we do have that does distinguish them, and that is the polarization tracker that Lee DeWitt has. They have attitudes toward the elites and voters for a few different waves. We don't actually find that much that's different, though with the voter measure, the effects of affective polarization on other things with the cross-lag models were more muted than with the elite measure.
Mark, if you wanted to jump in with your question, then we'll turn it over to Robert.
Cool, thanks. Thanks for your talk, Joe. Really appreciate it. I like the useful longitudinal models in this setting. So one of the things that keeps me up at night, and kind of mostly figuratively, is the random intercept models are, I think, better than the cross-lag models, but they also have their own set of kind of assumptions of the causal model. And I'm never quite sure if it really makes sense either, actually. So like they're kind of suggesting that if you are, up a little bit at time 1, you'll be up a little bit on the other measure at time 2. And I'm not really sure that that's kind of how it's working and on the time scale, if that's how that's working, because we're controlling for tons of other stuff. And I guess I'm curious, like, if you model free, you don't have to think about a particular longitudinal model. What do you think is the causal process, if there is one, between effective polarization and these democratic outcomes? And then kind of work backwards from there and maybe identifying a good model for it. Because I'm kind of always a little bit worried we're using these off-the-shelf models, which might not have the assumptions we really want them to have.
Yeah, so this is a good question. If I were to step back from the modeling and just think about what is it that I would think would even be happening when it comes to the effects of affective polarization. I'll just focus on that rather than the reverse causation, because we could go down a rabbit hole with that as well. You can imagine that, okay, affective polarization is standing in for a certain level of fear of what the other side might do in power, a certain level of anger towards perhaps what they have done in the past, a certain level of contempt, sort of a cocktail of various types of emotions. And that then lead people to certain types of other conclusions that they might make. It's like, oh, well, if they've done this kind of thing before, they're going to do even worse next time. I've got to stop them. And there could be kind of positive ways of doing that, which are sort of participating in politics. And there could be more sort of democratically negative ways of doing that, like closing polling stations where outpartisans will be. So if I were to kind of step back in a model-free sense, that's what I think would be going on, which also goes to the point of the other person who said that affective polarization isn't the greatest measure for this kind of cocktail of things.
Yeah, I guess then what I would wonder, so not just like besides the measure, although I think I have some disagreements about the comments on the measure anyways, but I just wonder if like the process you describe, is that really well captured by even the random intercept cross-seg model? And if not, then maybe we want to kind of look to other parts of the longitudinal kind of panel model literature to find models that are better fits. But we can maybe talk about that another time. Thanks for your talk.
It'll be great to talk, and thank you.